Loved You Better Than You Knew by Mrs. Alex McVeigh Miller. Copyright 1897, now in the public domain. Chapter 1. Cupid in the Rain. Love, it began with a glance, grew with the growing flowers, smiled in a dreamful trance, recked not the passage of hours. Grief, it began with a word, grew with the winds that raved, a prayer for pardon unheard, pardon in turn uncraved. The bridge so easy to sever, the stream so swift to be free, till the brook became a river, and the river became a sea. Life, it began with a sigh, grew with the leaves that are dead, its pleasures with wings to fly, its sorrows with wings of lead. Could one lift the impenetrable veil of mystery that hides the future from our curious eyes, what secrets would often be revealed, what shadows would fall upon hearts now light and thoughtless, shadows of grief, of horror, and despair. It is better not to know, agree the poets and sages. Beautiful Cynthia Donn did not think of that. You have enough to eat, to drink, and to wear, and a good home. What more do you want? The girl looked at the dingy sitting room, her own shabby gray gown, then out at the dismal landscape blurred by the rain and low-hanging clouds, with something like frank contempt, and answered recklessly, I want pretty clothes and jewels, beautiful surroundings, gay times and lovers, such as other girls have instead of this humdrum, poky existence. So there. Humph! It was all Mrs. Flint said aloud, but to herself she added, Good land! I do wish my brother would come home from his eternal wanderings and take charge of his rattle-brained daughter. She's too pretty and restless, and I don't see how I'm going to hold her down much longer. Cynthia Donn was 17 now, and ever since she had been given into her aunt's sole keeping at 5 years old, the straight-laced soul, who was as prim and particular as an old maid, had been engaged in the difficult task of holding down her spirited young niece. She had even erred on the side of prudence, so great was her anxiety to bring her up in the way she should go. When the lovely child first came, her aunt said frankly to all, I don't want anybody ever to tell Cynthia that she is pretty. She can find it out for herself by just looking in the glass, objected one of her cronies. I'll tend to that, said Mrs. Flint crustily, and she furnished her rooms with cracked and distorted mirrors, whose blurred surfaces gave back indeed no fair reflection of the child's beauty. She carried out her program further by dressing the child in the plainest, commonest clothing, and plaiting all her wealth of golden curls in a single tail down her back, though she could not prevent it, even then, from breaking out on her brow and neck in enchanting little ringlets that a ballroom belle might have envied. To her dearest crony, Mrs. Flint excused her course by saying, confidentially, Cynthy's mother, who is dead now, was the vainest and prettiest creature on earth, and she did wicked work with her beauty. I don't want to say aught against her now that she is dead, but Cynthia must have a different raising, that's all. My brother said so when he put her in my charge. Bring her up good and simple in your old-fashioned way, Rebecca, was what he said. That's right. Favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. That's Cynthy's Bible verse, and I hope she'll live up to it, returned the good crony, Deacon Rood's wife. So Cynthia Donn was reared simply and plainly, almost to severity. She received her education at the public school, and at home helped her aunt with the housework. Surreptitiously she read poetry and novels. Such a simple, quiet life, just like thousands and thousands of others. But Cynthia was outgrowing it now. She was 17, the most romantic age in the world, and she chafed at the dreariness of her life. School days were ended now, and her merry mates had their new gowns, their dances, and their lovers. There were none of these for Cynthia Donn. Mrs. Flint said her niece was nothing but a child yet, so she was not permitted to attend parties, and she vowed she had no money to spend on finery. As for lovers, if she had any, The bravest would not have dared present himself at Mrs. Flint's door. She would have said to him, as to the veriest tramp, "Be off!" It was just the life to drive a pretty, spirited girl frantic with impatience of the present, and longings for something better than she had known, the longing that found impatient expression that afternoon, when she watched the dead leaves flying in sodden drifts beneath the chill November rain. After Mrs. Flint's curt rejoinder to her complaints, she remained silent several minutes, drumming impatiently on the pane, then burst out, "Oh, Aunt Beck, don't you want me to run down to the post office for your Christian Advocate?" "In all this storm?" "Oh, I won't mind it a bit. I'm in a mood for fighting the elements." "Then take your umbrella and overshoes and hurry back." "Yes, Aunt." Glad to escape from the monotony of the little brown house, she hurried out into the teeth of the storm and made her way through the village streets to the little post office. The rain blew in her face, and the wind crimsoned her cheeks and made her dark eyes flash like stars. Cynthia did not care. In her splendor of youth and health, she found it exhilarating. But going back, the storm, that had been gathering its forces for a fiercer onslaught, increased in angry violence. She had left the paved main street too now, and was emerging into the thinly populated suburbs where her home was situated. A great gust of wind met her at the corner of a street, taking her breath with its fierce onslaught, wrapping her damp skirts about her ankles, and whisking her umbrella from her grasp. She chased it wildly, almost a block, only to see it whirled into the middle of the street and crushed under the wheels of a heavily loaded farm wagon lumbering into the little town. Meanwhile, the vagrant wind pelted her with drifts of dead leaves, and the floodgates of heaven opened and poured down torrents of water. "Take my umbrella, Miss Dawn," cried the gay musical voice of a young man, who had been chasing her as fast as she flew after the umbrella. Turning with a quick start, she looked into the face of Arthur Varian, a newcomer in the town, with whom she had recently formed an acquaintance. His laughing blue eyes were irresistible, and she cried merrily as she took shelter under the umbrella. "Didn't I look comical chasing the parachute? I was hoping no one saw me. Thank you, but I cannot deprive you of it." "Then you will let me hold it over you? It is large enough for both." Stepping along by her side and giving her the best half of it as they struggled along against the high wind. "I saw you coming out of the post office and have been trying to overtake you ever since. I thought perhaps you would allow me the pleasure of walking home with you," continued Arthur Varian, bending his admiring blue eyes on the beautiful face by his side. The bright arched face with its large, soft, dark eyes, set off by the aureole of curly golden hair, now blown into the most enchanting spiral rings by the wind and rain. He had met her several times before, and he knew enough of her lonely life to make him sympathize with her forlornness, even if her beauty had not already charmed him with its girlish perfection. Cynthia met that glance, and looked down with a kindling blush and a wildly beating heart, for it was of him she had been thinking when she uttered her complaints to Mrs. Flint, longing for the privileges of other young girls of her class, that she might have opportunities of meeting him and winning his heart. Who could blame her? For Arthur Varian was very winning and handsome, tall, with wavy brown hair, regular features, a slight brown mustache, a beautiful mouth. "Just made for kissing," vowed all the girls. Well dressed, and having that indefinable air of ease and elegance that betokens good breeding joined to prosperity. Perhaps the fates had heard Cynthia's longing for something to happen, for the storm now gathered fresh force, and the darkening earth was irradiated by a vivid and brilliant flash of lightning, followed by a terrific thunder peal. The rain poured out of heaven like a waterfall, and the fierce driving gale caught the frightened girl up like a feather and tossed her against the young man's breast and into his arms that clasped and held her protectingly. while all about them the air was darkened with flying debris and broken branches of trees that swayed and creaked and bent and crashed in agony beneath the cyclonic force of the elements. Cynthia was not a coward, but the situation was enough to strike terror to the bravest heart. The edge of a cyclone had indeed struck the village, and in almost an instant of time dozens of trees had been uprooted, several houses unroofed, and the air filled with flying projectiles, one of which suddenly struck Arthur Varian with such force that both he and his companion were hurled to the ground. It was a portion of a tin roof, and cut a gash on the young man's hand from which the blood began to stream in a ruddy tide. In another minute the wind began to abate, and they struggled up to their feet. "Oh, you are cut! You are bleeding! And you did it to save me! I saw you ward off that horrible missile from me with your hand. It must have killed me had I received the blow, for as it was, it grazed my head. Oh, what can I do? Let me bind your hand to stop the blood," sobbed Cynthia, unwinding the silk scarf from her neck and wrapping it tightly, with untaught skill, about his wrist above the wound to stop the spurting blood. Chapter 2. One Golden Hour. She trembled and paled as the warm blood spurted over her own white and dainty hands as she essayed the task, and her heart throbbed wildly with new and sweet emotion. She could have clasped her arms about his neck and wept over the cruel wound he had received in her defense and for her sake. "Thank you, that will do very well," Arthur Varian cried gratefully, and taking her hand gently, he added, "I see we are almost at the gates of my home. You must come in with me till the storm is over, then I will take you home in the carriage." Thoroughly frightened, and glad of a shelter from the still angry elements, Cynthia accompanied him inside the gates of the finest residence in the county, Idlewild, as it was called, being a large rambling old stone mansion, exceedingly picturesque in style, and surrounded by a fine estate in lawns, gardens, and virgin woodlands. For many years the place had been tenantless, save for the old housekeeper in charge, but last summer it had been carefully renovated, and Arthur Varian and his widowed mother, who owned the place, had come there to live. As the young man led Cynthia in, he added thoughtfully, "You are quite drenched, but my mother will give you some hot tea and dry clothing, and perhaps that will prevent your getting sick." "Oh, I don't think the wetting will hurt me. I'm very strong," Cynthia answered, adding bashfully, "I shouldn't like your mother to see me looking like I had been fished out of the river. You had better take me to the housekeeper. I know her well. She has been lending me novels and poetry from your library ever since I was a little girl." And, in fact, before they rang the bell, the front door flew open, and the old woman appeared, pouncing upon Cynthia and exclaiming, "Come right in and out of the wet, you poor dear child. I saw it all from the window, and I thought you both were killed when the piece of tin knocked you both down. I believe it is a piece off of our own roof. My heart jumped in my mouth, and I was about to faint when I saw you both rising to your feet, and I got better at once. But law sakes, wasn't it terrible? Your hand's cut too, ain't it, Mr. Varian? Well, I'll see to it in a minute, as soon as I take Cynthia to my room." Leading the dripping girl along corridors to a plain, neat bedroom, she produced a dainty white nightgown, saying, "There, honey, just strip off your wet clothes and put on that, and jump into my bed and give her up warm, whiles I go and sew up that cut on Mr. Arthur's hand, for I can do it just as neat as any doctor. Then I'll dry your clothes and brew you both some bone-set tea to keep you from catching cold." She bustled away, and Cynthia gladly did as she was bid, looking ruefully at the puddles of water that streamed from her clothing onto the neat Brussels carpet. When Mrs. Bowles returned, she was indeed covered up in the warm bed, with only her bright eyes and the top of her golden head visible. "Do you feel chilly, dearie? Drink this to warm your blood," she said, forcing a bitter concoction of bone-set tea on the protesting girl, adding, Law, now, 'tisn't so bad after all, is it? Why, Mr. Varian drank his dose without so much as a wry face. Law, honey, but that was a deep cut. It almost severed an artery. It took all my nerve to sew it up, I tell you, and he'll have to carry his hand in a sling some time, sure." "He saved my life," cried Cynthia eagerly. "I would have received that blow on my head, but that he so quickly warded it off with his hand. See, it just grazed my temple," showing a little bleeding scratch under her ringlets. "Dearie me, let me put a strip of court plaster on it. There, it'll be well in a day or two. Now, Cynthia, you take a little nap whiles I hang your clothes to dry in the laundry," gathering them up into a bucket. "I've ruined your carpet," sighed the girl. "Oh, no. It'll be all right when it's dry. Them colors won't run. Don't worry over that, but shut your eyes and go to sleep," bustling out again. "Dear old soul," sighed Cynthia, grateful for the kiss pressed on top of her curly head. She shut her eyes, but she was too nervous to sleep. She lay listening to the storm that still raged outside, and wondering what her aunt would think of her protracted stay, if she would be angry or just frightened. Then her thoughts flew to Arthur Varian, his tender smiles, his bonny blue eyes. "I will never marry any man but a blue-eyed one," she thought thrillingly, and at last fell into a gentle doze induced by weariness, the warmth of the bed, and the dose she had swallowed. The nap lasted an hour, and when she opened her eyes, Mrs. Bowles was rocking placidly by the cozy fire in the twilight. "Oh, I have been asleep. How long?" she cried uneasily. "Most an hour. Do you feel rested?" "Oh, yes, indeed, and I'd like to get up and go home. Are my clothes dry?" "Oh, no, not yet. And as for that gray woolen frock of yours, it has shrunk that much you can never hook it up again, I can tell you that. But no matter. You've had it 2 years already. I know, and it was too skimp for a growing girl anyway. But Mrs. Varian has sent you in a suit of her clothes to put on, and when you're dressed you are to take tea with her and her son." "Oh, but Mrs. Bowles, I ought to go home at once. Aunt Beck will be so uneasy over me." "Listen to the wind and the rain, child. The storm is still raging, and the horses can't be taken out till the weather clears up. So make your mind easy and get up and dress, for Mrs. Varian will be in to see you presently." Cynthia got up rather nervously, with a little dread of Mrs. Varian, whom she had seen at church and out riding. A beautiful, haughty-looking woman, with olive skin and flashing dark eyes, very young-looking to have a grown son of 23 or 4. "I would rather have my own clothes," she said pleadingly. "They are all over mud and water, child, and I don't think the maid can have them fit for you till tomorrow. Mrs. Varian very kindly offered you the loan of hers, and unless you wear them you'll have to go to bed again, that's all. Here, let me help you," said Mrs. Bowles, beginning to slip the garments over Cynthia's shining head. "But this crimson silk with white lace trimmings, it is too fine for me, dear Mrs. Bowles." "It can't be helped, for this is more likely to fit. Too tight in the waist for her, she said, and she never wore it but twice. And see, it laps over 2 inches on you. But I can hide that with the lace at the neck and the bow at the waist. Now let me comb your hair loose over your shoulders, it's so damp yet. My, how it crimples up and curls and shines in the light. You look well, Cynthia Dawn." She would have said beautiful, but she was mindful of Mrs. Flint's objection, though she said to herself, "She can't keep Mr. Arthur from finding it out, that's sure. He knows it already by the look in his eyes when he brought her in, and it's hot, impulsive blood that flows in the Varian's veins. What is going to come of this accident, I wonder? For I saw love in her eyes when she told me how he saved her life. I hope he didn't save it, just to blight it." Cynthia went to the old woman's mirror and looked at herself in the unaccustomed gown. The glass was not blurred and cracked like those at home, and it gave back her charming reflection truthfully. "Why, How pretty I look!" she cried, gazing in frank delight at the beautiful vision, the lissom form, just above medium height, the regular features, the fair arch face, the starry dark eyes, the rose-red mouth, the enchanting dimples, and the aureole of golden hair that set it off like a halo of light. "Why, Mrs. Bowles, I did not know I was so pretty. But perhaps it's only the dress." "Fine feathers make fine birds," returned the housekeeper discreetly. "Yes," sighed Cynthia, but she continued to gaze at herself in delight, wondering, shyly, what Arthur Varian would think of her in his mother's fine gown. Then she turned with a start, for a light tap at the door announced the entrance of Mrs. Varian, and the housekeeper hastened to present the young girl to her mistress. Both thrilled with admiration, for both were rarely beautiful in their opposite types. The elder a brunette of the finest style, the younger a dark-eyed blonde, so rarely seen, so much admired. "I hope you have quite recovered from your fright, Miss Dawn," her hostess said in a voice so exquisitely modulated that it was as pleasant as music. Cynthia murmured in reply that she had enjoyed a delicious rest and was so grateful for the loan of the clothes that made it possible for her to escape from bed. "I dare say our good Mrs. Bowles would have liked to keep you there all night. She suggested that plan to Arthur after dosing him with bitter herb tea, but he disregarded her advice and is now waiting impatiently for you," rejoined the lady, casting an arch glance at the old woman while she took Cynthia's hand and drew her toward the door. When the door closed on them, the old housekeeper wagged her head doubtfully. "How sweet my mistress can be when she pleases! But I wonder if she would be as kind if she guessed what I have read in those young people's eyes. That story of love, love between a rich young man and a poor young girl, that folks like Mrs. Varian call misalliances," she muttered uneasily. No matter what the outcome was to be, Cynthia Dawn had come to the happiest night of her life. Though outside the windows the wild wind and rain swirled and beat with ghostly fingers, inside Mrs. Varian's luxurious drawing room all was warmth and light and pleasure. The lady and her son exerted themselves to make their young guest happy, and she was so glad and grateful in her pleasant surroundings that all were mutually sorry when toward 10 o'clock the storm abated, and the moon struggled fitfully through the lowering clouds. "I must go home," cried Cynthia, with wholesome dread of Mrs. Flint's wrath, and their warmest urgings could not prevail on her to stay, though in her secret heart she longed to do so forever. "I shall bring back your clothes tomorrow," she laughed, as Mrs. Varian bid her a cordial good night. Then Arthur handed her into the waiting carriage, stepped in by her side, and the driver closed the door. And of that ride home we shall hear more in our next chapter. Chapter 3. The Sweet Old Story. Mrs. Flint grew very uneasy over her absent niece as the short afternoon waned, and the fury of the storm increased to positive danger for any luckless pedestrian. After fidgeting and worrying until the early twilight fell, she began to say to herself that Cynthia was probably all right anyway. She had doubtless gone into some friends for shelter and would not likely return until morning. She took her frugal tea alone and in something like sadness, for Cynthia had seldom been absent from a meal before, and she began to feel what a loss it was to miss the fair young face about the house. She suddenly realized the tenderness lying dormant in her heart for the willful girl. She sat down by the cozy fire with her knitting and listened to the tempest of wind and rain soughing in the trees outside, and Cynthia's rebellion that afternoon kept repeating itself over and over in her brain until she muttered aloud, "She wants fine things and parties and lovers, does she? Well, well, I suppose it's natural enough for her mother's child, and for any young girl for that matter, but where's she going to get them? The lovers would be easy enough. She's as pretty as a pink. but I don't want to encourage her vanity, and it's better to save the money her father sends till she needs it worse. What if he should die way off yonder somewhere, and maybe not leave her a penny? I wish he'd come home, I do, or I wish she was homely as sin, with red hair and freckles, and a snub nose like Jane Ann Johnson. So she fretted and fumed until past 10 o'clock, and that was an hour beyond her usual bedtime, but somehow she could not get Cynthia out of her mind, could not bear to retire while she was away. So she kept glancing at the window, though scarcely expecting her to arrive before morning. How could she, in such a storm, though the wind had lulled somewhat, and the patter of the rain was dulled on the drifts of dead leaves that muffled the sound of carriage wheels, pausing too, so that Mrs. Flint almost jumped out of her skin when there came suddenly a loud rat-a-tat, rat-a-tat upon the front door. But she was not naturally nervous, so after a moment's startled indecision, she flew to the door and demanded, through the keyhole, to know who was there. "It is Cynthia, Aunt," returned a sweet, mirthful voice. With a sigh of relief, the old lady unlocked the door, and there stepped into the narrow hall a vision that took her breath away. Was it Cynthia Dawn, or a fairy princess, this beautiful creature in the crimson silk and misty lace, the furred white opera cloak falling from her shoulders, the rippling lengths of sunny hair enveloping her like a halo, the dark eyes beaming with that light that never was on sea or land, but only in the glance of the happy and the loving? "Cynthia Dawn," she began in a dazed voice, but just then she became aware that a tall and handsome young man, hat in hand, was standing on the threshold. She knew who he was. Her pastor had introduced her last Sunday at church to the master of Idlewild. "Good evening, Mrs. Flint," he began beamingly. "I have brought Cynthia home safe to you. My mother took care of her during the storm." He paused, faintly hoping that she would ask him to enter. It was so early yet. But he did not yet know Mrs. Flint, much as he had heard of her eccentricities. She simply bridled and returned in her stiffest manner, "I'm sure we are very much obliged to your mother, and you too. Good evening." Thus curtly dismissed, the young man shot a tender glance at his sweetheart, and bowed himself out into the night again, the lady slamming the door behind him before he was fairly down the steps. "Oh, Aunt Beck, how could you be so rude after all their kindness to me? And he saved my life, too. Didn't you see his arm in a sling?" indignantly. "I don't know as I noticed it. I was so frustrated seeing you bring a beau home, and you nothing but a child yet," snapped the old lady. "Child!" echoed Cynthia scornfully, as she held her chilly fingers to the blaze and the ruddy light played over her beautiful garments. "But what are you doing with the silk gown and that grand white cloak all brocade and ermine? I don't understand," cried the old lady suspiciously. Cynthia laughed out gaily, happily, her eyes shining, her voice as sweet as silver bells. "Why, I was caught in the rain and almost drowned, Aunt Beck, and my wretched old duds were nothing but mud and water, so Mrs. Varian lent me these things to come home in. Aren't they becoming? Don't I look pretty?" setting her graceful head on one side, like a bird. "Humph! Pretty is as pretty does," grunted her aunt, though she could not keep her eyes off the charming creature as she flung herself back in an easy-chair and continued gaily, "If you are not sleepy, Aunt Beck, I'll tell you all about it." "I guess I can keep my eyes open," ungraciously, though she was dying of curiosity. Thereupon Cynthia related all the events of the evening, from the time she had left home until she bid Mrs. Varian good night, to return in the grand carriage with the handsome master of Idlewild. Clasping her tiny hands, she cried in an ecstasy, "Oh, Aunt, I can't tell you how I enjoyed it all. Mrs. Varian is as proud and beautiful as a queen, but she was so kind and sweet to me that I felt quite at home in her grand house. As for her son, oh—" and Cynthia paused, and blushed divinely. Mrs. Flint snapped irately, "Now, Cynthia Dawn, don't you go getting your head turned by idle flatteries from rich young men. Anybody but a silly child would know they don't mean anything." "Oh, Aunt Beck, please don't call me a child any more. I am as grown up as anybody, and you know it. 17 last April. And, wistfully and defiantly all at once, he does mean it. He loves me dearly, and we are engaged." Aunt Beck gave a jump of uncontrollable surprise. "Cynthia Dawn, you don't mean it!" "Yes, I do, Aunt Beck. I have promised to marry Arthur Varian." "But land's sakes, child! Oh, I forgot. Well, girl, then, you don't hardly know each other." "Oh, yes, we do. We have been acquainted some time. We fell in love weeks ago, and he told me in the carriage he loved me and wanted to marry me." Chapter 4. Breakers Ahead. Mrs. Flint was so surprised she could not speak. She could only stare in wonder at the beautiful, excited creature with her happy face. "Oh, Aunt, you are not angry, are you? He's very, very nice, I'm sure. And rich, too. He said my every fancy should be gratified, that he would worship me. You will give your consent, won't you? Because he's coming here tomorrow morning to ask you." Mrs. Flint found her voice and muttered sarcastically, "A wonder he didn't ask me tonight. Why didn't you tell him you would have to get your father's consent?" "Because Papa has deserted me ever since I was small and cares nothing for me. It is you I've had to look for, the care of father and mother both. Why, look you, Papa has never written me a line in all these years. He does not care what becomes of me, and we shall not ask him anything. You are my guardian and will give us leave to marry, won't you, dear?" "When, Cynthia?" "Oh, very soon, he said. Not later than Christmas, anyway. We don't want to wait long. You'll be willing, won't you?" Impetuously. "I don't know, dear. I'll have to sleep on it before I make up my mind. You've given me such a surprise. Though I don't say but that it's a grand match for a girl like you, Cynthia. He said I was made for a prince." "Of course. People in love are silly enough to say anything. But take your candle and go to bed now, Cynthia, and we will talk about this again tomorrow." "Good night, Aunt." And she lingered, perhaps hoping for a kindlier word. The old lady, moved in spite of herself, and secretly proud of Cynthia's conquest, actually kissed the rosy cheek, saying merrily, "Good night, Mrs. Varian that is to be." Cynthia's heart leaped with joy and pride, for she took this concession to mean approbation of her choice. With the chorus of a love song Arthur had sung that evening on her happy lips, she went upstairs to her pretty bedroom and was soon fast asleep and dreaming sweetly of her splendid lover. But as for Mrs. Flint, she sat down again by the fire, in a sort of dazed condition, to think it all over. Little Cynthia engaged to be married. Why, it was like some strange dream. But the more she thought it over, the better pleased she was, for Cynthia's future had been a burden to her mind, and this would be such a relief, marrying her off to such a good catch as Arthur Varian. Why, the little girl had done as well for herself as the most anxious father could desire, and she decided to give her consent to the match tomorrow without the formality of asking his advice. Just as she came to this conclusion, she was startled again by another rat-a-tat upon the door. "Good gracious! Who can it be knocking there at midnight almost? Some lunatic, surely. Or maybe Cynthia's beau come back to ask for her tonight, too impatient to wait for morning," she soliloquized as she sallied out into the hall with the demand, "Who's there?" To her utter consternation and amazement, a manly voice replied impatiently, "Your long-lost brother, Rebecca. Open the door. The wind is very cutting." Unlocking the door, a traveler stepped into the hall. a tall, brown-bearded man of perhaps 45, blue-eyed, and rarely handsome. "Welcome, Everard!" she cried, and put her arm around his neck and kissed him with unwonted affection. He had been her baby half-brother when she was married, the pet and pride of the family. "Oh, I have such news for you! This return is very timely!" she exclaimed, when they were seated again by the fireside. Thereupon she poured out the exciting story of his daughter's engagement, dilating with unusual volubility on the eligibility of the suitor. "I suppose I shall have to consent," he said carelessly, then, "Oh, by the way, what is the young man's name?" "Arthur Varian." The man sprung to his feet as if she had thrust a knife into his heart. "Arthur Varian!" he repeated, trembling like a leaf in a storm, his face growing deathly white under the bronze of travel. "Why, Everard, what is the matter? Do you know him? Is there anything wrong about him?" "Yes. No, that is, I must see him first. Oh, Rebecca, this is a terrible thing. How fortunate that I came in time to nip this in the bud, for Arthur Varian can never marry my daughter." "You will break her heart." He dropped back into his seat, groaning. "I cannot help it, miserable man that I am, for Cynthia Dawn had better be dead than the bride of Arthur Varian."